Hi, so this lesson is going to talk you through the difference between formal and informal social control. So some of the key differences that you'll need to remember. Social control itself is considered as an important process within socialisation. So there are universal norms and rules, and the basic principle is that all members of society should follow these universal norms and rules. Deviation from those rules or from those norms can result in punishment towards the individual, and that helps make sure that social order remains in place. So social control really is the process of regulation, and it's the regulation of individuals' behaviour or group behaviours within a society. So it is specific to social norms and can therefore change in different countries, different cultures and different contexts. And what it does is encourages conformity and obedience from society towards those accepted norms and rules that are in place. It can include social and political mechanisms. So political, for example, putting in place the law, particular social policies and expectations. Social mechanisms are more informal, so that can include things like the disciplinary system within a school, parental discipline, and expectations of people within a community, and so on. So this is where we start to see the difference between what is formal and what is informal. So when we look at formal social control, it's implemented by authorised agents. So these are the systems and organisations within criminal justice, such as police officers and the courts and the legal system, which have very specific rules and expectations, and there are very fixed sanctions that can be put in place. They are implemented through things like employers or schools. So you will have contracts of employment, expectations, a behaviour policy, for example, in school, and that formal system outlines exactly what has to be done to meet those standards. Military officers on a more sort of global level, whereby norms and values that might be broken across countries can lead to situations such as conflict and war. So all those institutions are systems that have very rigid and very specific rules. So that is laid out, it's very clear. Quite often you have to sign up to those rules and be made aware of those rules. They are underpinned by ideologies and moral beliefs, much of which we're compelled to obey. So things like the law around murder and manslaughter, for example, naturally most individuals see that as a norm for social behaviour. You are compelled to obey that within yourself on sort of a moral judgment, but also you are compelled to obey through the process of the legal system. So things like punishments, fines, being able to exclude someone from school. There is some sort of system in place that makes you obey those rules. Courts and judges, military officers, police officers, schools, teachers, government agencies, etc., etc. We all enforce formal control systems. It's quite often seen to be a last option in many ways, particularly criminal law. There are systems of informal social control that are kind of relied on to underpin those formal control networks. So, for example, appropriate socialisation, teaching children the norms and values of society, either through primary socialisation with the family or secondary socialisation through external agencies like school, community, religion, and so on. So quite often this is something that is brought in when a desired behaviour becomes impossible to manage or impossible to enforce through informal measures of social control. The processes by which formal control come about in democratic societies such as the UK means that they're determined through legislation by our elected representatives. So the laws are passed through the House of Commons, the House of Lords, and then enshrined in state law. There are many situations and different levels of severity where formal control is used within different countries. So, for example, again, going back to something like murder, it can range from imprisonment through to the death penalty, depending on what culture and country you come from. So most formal social control is practiced through law, in addition to rules and regulations against deviant social behaviour that are implemented by other agencies such as education systems, welfare systems, and so on. Certain laws, for example, the prohibition of murder, are directed at all members of society. So that is very, very specific to individuals. Fishing and hunting regulations, for example, are for certain groups. So things like having to have a fishing license before you go fishing. Therefore, the laws around illegal fishing or hunting only apply to those who are not licensed and have not gone down the necessary processes in order to undertake those particular activities. It's a bit like driving without a driving license. So you're breaking the law until that moment that you pass your test and you drive with a driving license, which formally allows you to be behind the wheel of a vehicle. So prior to that, any driving of a car without a driving license would mean the law would take over, and that would be an element of formal social control. There are laws for businesses as well as people. So corporate law governs the behaviour of many of society's institutions. So there are laws around things like collaboration and working together for price fixing. For example, things like Ofcom monitor communication systems and make sure price fixing isn't taking place with things like your mobile phone bill. And again, those laws are in place to protect wider society. Formal control is conducted by the government and organisations using their law enforcement mechanisms. So that can be everything from the police and the justice system that we're quite aware of, to things like the health and safety executive, who can enforce health and safety laws at work. Things like the General Medical Council, who enforce legislation and appropriate medical professionals, and so on. It can also be conducted through formal sanctioning, so that includes what we're commonly aware of, things like fines and imprisonment. It can be gross misconduct, dismissal from a workplace, exclusion from school, and so on. In addition, it's also useful to look at those who exercise formal control outside of the military and justice systems. So it's worth bearing in mind when you're talking about formal social control, you're not just talking about the nature of criminal justice systems and the people that bring that into force, but you are looking at all sorts of different institutions, some of which you may not come into contact with, but they have a method of enforcing formal social control. So, for example, HMRC and the tax office will manage any illegal tax evasion behaviours and so on. So what I would like you to do is, using the information on the next slide, if you can pause the recording to complete the descriptions of the different types of people and organisations that use formal social control. So moving on to informal social control in society. So this is exercised by wider society, so parents, religious organisations, the wider community, and it doesn't have any formally stated rules or laws. So this is more about normal behaviours and customs within particular contexts. So social control is performed informally by agents on their own, really. It's not an official capacity. So parents, for example, might make decisions about appropriate expectations for behaviour, and they may well bring in their own sort of reprimands and punishments, things like being grounded, having your phone taken off you, in order to draw on that element of social control. Most traditional societies embed informal social control into their culture in order to establish order. So those expectations that you have, how you behave when you're out in public, you know, those expectations, everything from appropriate clothing in public places right through to things like queuing up at a buffet or in the school canteen to get your dinner, and those expectations that you behave in those particular ways. The way in which that's controlled is things like shame, so making someone feel shameful for something they've said, something they've done, a way they've behaved. Quite often sarcasm, so being sarcastically ridiculed and picked up on your behaviour. Direct criticism, so being told that you cannot behave like that or your behaviour is inappropriate. And social disapproval, so things like being left out of particular groups, not being invited to community events, and so on. Social discrimination and exclusion are informal methods of social control, quite often for extremely deviant cases. So this would be the exclusion of an individual or a group of people from wider society. Quite often this is associated with negativities, so discrimination and prejudice along those lines, but equally this does take place to exert informal social control on people who are causing problems. So young people hanging around in a particular place may well be excluded from that place by the people who either own it or live nearby, those kinds of situations. One of the main impacts of informal social control is how an individual in that situation is affected. So part of your identity comes from the groups with whom you are close, and the nature of your community, what you are doing, and your family relationships. So if that is challenged, it can have a knock-on effect on self-worth and self-esteem. So we all feel better if we have a nice group of friends, we're getting on, we're all sort of joining in with the same activity. So once that loss of group approval takes place, or that you're excluded from that group because of the nature of your behaviour, you feel quite low about yourself, your self-esteem will drop, and the idea is that because you seek approval from those who are around you, you tend to review your own behaviour, challenge yourself and change the way in which you are acting in order to fit better with the main group norms. The severity and nature of informal social control differs, and it differs against individuals, against groups, and in wider society. And it's quite effective really in a small group setting, so how your friends perceive you and the kind of way in which your peer groups exert social control of your behaviour. Your family, particularly if you're younger years, right through to probably about 14 before peer group membership becomes more important. Your local neighbourhood, so that can be, you know, everything from the street in which you live right through to your community, for example, how control is exercised within Nantwich and so on. It can be your work group, so your colleagues, your boss and so on, and it can be your classmates. In large and complicated societies, informal social control and disapproval can be quite easily ignored. So informal social control from high up, disapproval of somebody's behaviour and so on, doesn't have the same effect as direct disapproval with a group that you feel you are a member of, or that you seek the approval of. And that tends to be where formal social control would kick in. So a good example from recent issues, hundreds and thousands of people heading to beaches in Bournemouth. There was quite substantial national disapproval of their behaviour, of that particular group, but that disapproval from wider society doesn't really impact on those individuals, given that they're not close to them, they're not looking for somebody else's approval, and therefore informal social control in that kind of incident doesn't work. So in that kind of situation, you'd be looking at more formal controls, and they've talked about things like shutting down the beaches, giving people fines and things like that. So depending on the size of the group and the person who is disapproving of it can influence whether or not informal social control would actually work. So the three main groups that fall into the category for informal social control agents would be, first and foremost, your family, secondly, your friends, and then thirdly, your work colleagues. Each form of control leads to a level of sanctioning. Formal social control obviously has legal sanctions, informal has disapproval sanctioning. So sanctioning, without sanctioning, social control is basically impossible. So you have to have that use of sanctioning to remind people what is expected in terms of behaviour. So by exercising sanctions, you do two different things. First of all, you administer disapproval or punishment to the individual or group of individuals who have behaved in a particular way that goes against the social norms or values. And secondly, you are providing the rest of the society with an example of what will happen if you do behave in a particular way. So that encourages compliance through normative influence through the rest of society, because they don't want to receive the sanctions that have been given to other people. Therefore, they choose not to engage in that particular deviant behaviour. So there are four types of sanctions that are exercised in order to conform to the expectations of society. You have formal positive sanctions, formal negative sanctions, informal positive sanctions, and informal negative sanctions. So formal positive sanctions, positive being a good sanction, can include things like giving you social recognition, for example, the knighthood that the Queen does once a year. It can be things like bonuses in the workplace, award certificates in school. It can be even sort of simple things like praise, congratulations, giving someone approval and recognition. The idea of issuing positive sanctions is that it works better to encourage the desired behaviour than it does to discourage undesired behaviour. So by focusing on positive sanctions, that works really well to encourage the type of behaviour that you want to see, so you can control what you are expecting from people. Formal and negative sanctions are things like the use of shame, disapproval, exclusion, but it is also the sanctioning that can be done through the criminal justice system, such as imprisonment, fines, criminal records, community service, and so on. It can be within schools and businesses. So it might be that you get fired for a particular behaviour from your job, or you may get excluded from school for a particular behaviour. Informal positive sanctions are sanctions that are given on a more day-to-day basis. So again, it includes things like praise, celebrations, certificates and so on in an informal setting, but it can include the smallest things in society. So things like smiling at someone who opens a door for you, or saying thank you to a bus driver when you get on and off, reminding people of sort of appropriate moral behaviour and what's expected and preferred within society. Informal negative sanctions are, again, the use of things like social disapproval, frowning at someone who says something inappropriate and reminding them that that's not acceptable, and those kinds of negative actions towards another person, to remind them that their behaviour doesn't meet the social norms and therefore they need to change the way in which they're acting in that particular situation. So some of the key differences between a formal and informal. Formal social control is written, it is formalised, and it's coded into things like statements of law and rules and regulations. So it is a very, very fixed set of rules and laws that you must follow within a society. Informal control doesn't have any written rules or regulations for you to actually sort of pick up and have a look at what you're supposed to do. Formal control agencies are authorised, so they are generally created by governments. They are authorised to administer the rules and the regulations that are written down, whereas informal control agencies are usually created through social networks, different organisations, family, friends, peer groups and so on. Formal control is much more effective and stronger than informal control, so it does work substantially better. So any situations that can't be handled informally are usually subjected to formal social controls. So formal control even works in large groups of the population. So for example, we all drive to the 30-mile-an-hour speed limit in a 30-mile-an-hour zone because there is a formal sanction where you can get a fine and points on your licence. Therefore, it's affected for the vast majority of the country who will stick to the speed limit. Informal control really only works with smaller groups of people, so close friends, close family, close community, close peer groups and so on.